Now, can we get that together in any way other than in the complex test development processes of test publishers and organisations that have the resources to make substantial use of these kinds of psychometric models? Is it possible in a public examination system, for example? Well, we've always had serious attention to standards of performance in examinations with high-stakes assessments. They're based on a curriculum which expresses what it is we want students to learn. But the problems we face when we produce our results are the ones that you see more than anyone else. They see it in Australia as well, I can say, but you see it in your press reporting in the summer more than in most places. The debate about whether there's any kind of comparability over time in these assessments. And I'm pleased to see Alison Wolfe now in the Times Higher Education Supplement writing about the same problem with regard to first, second-class Division A, second-class Division B assessments at university as well, which are just as prone to shifts in meaning over time as grade distributions in public examinations. The trouble is that in a lot of the discussion, failure rate is used as the measure of standard. The only way to be sure that standards are being maintained is that a sufficient proportion of students are being failed. If you're not failing sufficient students, then standards must be declining. There is never the possibility that performance is rising. We actually expect performance to rise in almost every other area of human activity. We expect it of our sportsmen. We expect it of our businesses. We expect them to become more and more efficient. We expect it of government bureaucracies. But we almost start with a starting assumption that in the case of educational performance, it's not possible for a population to perform better. Well, then one might ask, how is it that Korea does better than England? How is it that Finland does much, much better than Germany? Is it not possible for Germany to raise its performance level to match that of Finland? Poland has just raised its performance on everything we've measured in the space of 3 years. That's arguably, there's a fairly good argument that it can be linked to the nature of a particular set of reforms they undertook. If you start with the assumption that things cannot be changed, then you have a real problem when you have to deal with the marked differences among countries in performances, particularly if you're a low-performing country that might aspire to do better. But we get captured in just this domestic debate about is an A still an A? In particular, is the A that these kids are getting now like the A I got when I was at school? Because if it is, and so many of them are getting it, and so many of these people that I don't have all that much respect for are getting it, what does that say about me? Now, standards are never absent in these examinations that we have. They're in the curriculum, they're in the examination. The problem is that once we use a norm-based style of reporting, we ignore all the information that the exam provides about standards. That's typically what's been done. I mean, I grew up in a system where 2 to 5% of students got an A, 7 to 11% of students got a B. It didn't matter whether the student body changed or anything. It was purely normative. And it expressed nothing about the level of learning of any of us. It just said where we stood in relation to one another. It wasn't that the exam didn't contain that information, or that the curriculum that the exam was assessing didn't contain claims about standards. It was just that we used a scoring process and a method of comparison among students that ignored all that information. Now, can we do better? You try in England. I've sat in examiners' meetings here and watched you try to do better than that. You use criteria defined that help you define grade boundaries. Those of you who perform in these meetings know that. You review previous year's scripts to see if what got an A last year is like what you're proposing to give an A to this year. That what just missed an A last year is like what will just missed an A this year. It's a very careful attempt to look at the actual performances and to see if they're comparable over time. You do, however, then pay attention to the distributions. You look at what proportion of people got an A last time and then say, well, if we set the boundary there, what proportion will get an A this time? And are we comfortable if it's moving up to that extent? Or if it's moving down to that extent, because there are cases where it moves in both directions, more often up than down, but it does move in both directions. And if it is moving, is there any evidence to suggest that the candidature has changed, that different kinds of students are doing the subject this time, that might justify the shift? There's another case which tries to in my view, more rigorously combine the two sets of information in a way that mirrors to the extent possible what I've just been showing you about the psychometric models. There is an attempt to develop band descriptors. There is an attempt to try and make sure those band descriptors, this is for an A, a B, a C or whatever, are consistent over time, not back 40 years, but are consistent from year to year over a growing number of years, and that then reports the results, the performance of students with respect to those criteria, while at the same time, for the reasons that they're necessary, report them normatively as well. This is in the New South Wales Higher School Certificates, the biggest exam system in Australia, about 60,000 students. It's small by your standards, but 60,000 students at the end of secondary school each year taking these exams. And every student gets one statement for each. I'm going to show you in more detail what's on that. You don't have to read that. Gets one statement for each subject taken, gets a summary document that captures the key information out of each of those, and gets a certificate to frame that says they actually got the higher school certificate. And if they get anything more worthwhile later in life, they can frame it over the top. Now, the higher school certificate for each course produces a statement like this. Now, the mark range is from 0 to 100. And there's norm reference information on the side, so that there is the distribution of the performances of all the students in that subject, plotted in the standard way we see distributions like that plotted vertically up the side of the scale. So you can see what proportion of students were up in band 6, what proportion were in band 5, and so on. There are descriptions for each of the standards, for each of the bands, and you don't need to read those, but you'll see it in the printed paper later. They're actually descriptions of the mathematics, in this case, that a student who's at level 6 is able to do. And that reflects what's in the curriculum. This is what the curriculum expects of the best students. This is what the exams assess for the best students. And we can see what proportions of students are able to do the most that the curriculum was expecting, and what proportion of students can do less. Minimum is located at the point of 50. So there is actually a definition of what is a minimum requirement in terms of standards. If you can't do at least that, you will be given a result that is lower than 50. And that will signal an unacceptable level of performance. The student gets an examination mark. The student, as in this country, gets a school assessment mark as well. And those are combined to produce the overall mark that the student obtains. And you can see here's a student that's in band 5, towards the bottom of band 5. So you're not just saying this is a band 5 student, you can see where in band 5 the student is. The underlying scale is evident, as well as the band descriptor and the band label. And you can see how many candidates there were in the subject, so you know whether this is a large enrolment subject or not. Then the student gets a summary document that shows here are the subjects they took, here's the assessment mark. That's very New South Wales language. The assessment mark is the school mark. The examination mark is the second column, and the combined overall result, the HSC, the high school certificate mark, and then which performance band the student was in. So the band you know, but you know the underlying metric as well. And then in addition, you're told what subjects the student took the year before as preliminary courses. Now, most students take 5 subjects in the final year, most take 6 in preparation and drop one of those. Nowhere else in the world does anyone think it's enough for students to do just 3 subjects in the final years of secondary school. I mean, the thing that makes reform so difficult in England is the A-levels in every respect. And in particular, the narrowness of the A-levels, that a student can do maths and physics as A-levels. Nowhere else in the world is that thought to be adequate. And because you've got such a narrow set of assessments, a narrow set of subjects studied, and such non-overlapping distributions in some cases, the